In this lecture, we will look at the rise of conservatism. We will focus generally from the 1960s to about the 1990s, ending with the presidency of Ronald Reagan for the most part. And I quickly want to address this political cartoon that you see here. So just so you know, and just you're aware of, when it comes to political affiliation, we find that their beliefs often change and evolve with the times. So in this political cartoon, you see a Democrat saying "my planks," and then the elephant, which represents the Republican, says some of the stuff is practically brand new and has things like a balanced budget, New Deal criticism, which is something we'll talk about, sound money, a sound economy. There is like a political shift happening around the 1930s, where the Democrats were basically, not all of these, but had some of these concepts. And then the Great Depression hits, and there's a shift where Democrats were more about small government, and then they take on more kind of federal policies to try to alleviate some of the things that were happening during the Great Depression. Republicans were the opposite, right? If you know something about Lincoln, right? Lincoln's a great example of kind of big government. And by the 1960s, there's a shift happening to kind of this notion of small government, which is something that we'll cover in this lecture. So understand that political affiliation today is not the same as political affiliation 100 years ago. So keep that in mind. But again, we're going to show you where these shifts happen, focusing on conservatism for this lecture. So as a note before I actually begin, I want to make you aware of certain language that I'll be using in different parts of the lecture, because it's actually quite critical. This is offensive language. I do quote it when it's coming from a source, so it's not something that I believe or anything like that. So it's coming from either primary or secondary literature that I'm using to the research that I did to write this lecture. All right, so keep that in mind, partly because it needs to be put within the historical context. So the first thing we're going to do is examine the realignment of the political ideologies of the period. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that we're going to see how these political beliefs kind of change throughout the different decades. Number two, we're going to address how race played an important role in the rise of the new right. In the 1930s, for the most part, many Americans in general became New Deal Democrats because, the Republicans more or less were blamed for the Great Depression. So they looked to the federal government for support with many of the programs that came out. And, many of them were in support of these kind of federal policies. By the 1960s, that begins to change, particularly when the focus becomes centered around civil rights, and particularly when we see housing get impacted by this. So if you recall, when we looked at the 1950s, there's segregated housing in America. And by the 1960s, that begins to be done away with through government policies, right? This notion of big government. So many people were not okay with that because they were happy in their kind of suburban, more or less white neighborhoods. And as middle-class African Americans begin to move in, they become resentful of some of these government policies. So you see this shift to a kind of more conservative mindset in the 1960s. And then lastly, we're going to explain the triumph of conservatism in the 1980s, looking at how the right, for lack of a better word, wins, particularly with Reagan. Reagan becomes a culmination of some of these beliefs and tries to put theory into practice through certain policies, very heavily trying to emulate policies from the 1920s, particularly supply side economics. And we're going to see how, unfortunately, those policies ended up not working in that decade. All right, so if you're ready, let's look at the rise of conservatism. So let's begin. I want you to picture yourself living in the US in the mid 1960s. You saw in the last couple of chapters the fight for civil rights. However, you also saw that in the 1950s, America was a very different place. As the reading argued, along with historians in general, the 1950s has come to represent a time in America when things were quote unquote great. There was a baby boom, suburban homes were attainable for a specific part of the population, men were able to sustain their family in order for women to stay home and take control of their domain, the home. Young girls wore poodle skirts while young boys emulated a James Dean masculinity, all within a very safe, white utopian community. We have even labeled the period between 1950 to 1963 as the Pax Americana, a short window of tranquility that competes with 200 years of ancient Rome prosperity. However, as historians, we have come to question this period of the 1950s, particularly with the limited freedoms some people had, which included the working poor, people of color, women, and the gay community, just to name a few. For us today, we tend to romanticize the 1950s as simpler times, with strong family values, while living out in a white suburban haven. Much of this economic middle-class material culture could only be produced from the strength of labor unions, which conservatives will one day come to despise. Again, imagine yourself living in 1960s America and feeling like the America you once knew no longer exists. African Americans are now your neighbors. Pornography is considered quote unquote art. Women are not only advocating for economic independence, challenging the notion of the home sphere, but also fighting for the freedom to choose. Older Americans see healthcare as a fundamental right, and Keynesian economics reign supreme. In other words, government was spending in order for Americans to maintain their standard of living. And you were watching your TV daily hearing about a losing war, along with watching protests and social unrest everywhere, particularly in the inner cities. Though there's a lot more, these social shifts that we outline are what gave rise to the conservative movement from 1964 to 1990. Fear was the common denominator that was utilized as the glue that brought together different groups into an ideology that feared the growth of the federal government and the integration of the other into what they considered their community. So let's examine this history of the rise of conservatism by looking both at the micro and macro level to explore both the ideology and the way communities reacted. So let's begin with examining Compton as a case study of this political shift from the left to the right. As many of you are well aware, Compton, California has a notorious history in the public imagination, partly due to the growth of 1990s gangster rap with such groups as NWA. However, the history of Compton is directly tied to the notion of the American dream. Even George H.W. Bush lived there in 1949 for a short while. In fact, Compton was prime real estate as it was centered near Los Angeles, quote, automobile, steel, and food processing plants, unquote, allowing white Midwesterners who migrated into LA from the 1920s to the 1950s to live near their work. Compton, after all, was an all-American city as it had won the award in 1952, which prided itself in maintaining its racial exclusivity by instituting, quote, highly effective racially restrictive housing covenants in 1921, unquote. In addition, real estate agents who attempted to challenge segregation had their licenses revoked, while FHA loans were rejected to those that sought integration. Even affordable public housing was banned because it was viewed as quote unquote Negro housing, which to many was seen as a slippery slope towards integration. Police also played an important role in maintaining Compton white by harassing black people who dared to enter their quote unquote white spaces, often with community support who chanted slogans such as quote, keep the Negro north of 130th Street. Los Angeles was not the South, however. Yet those undertones of racial apartheid did seem to play a very significant role, particularly during the Black migration in the post-World War II era, which filled the city with not only different ethnic and racial groups, but also with polyglot communities. With major Supreme Court cases such as Shelley v. Kramer and Barrows v. Jackson, which abolished racially restrictive housing covenants, unquote, African Americans sought both economic and social opportunity in the West Coast, hoping to enter the middle class in places such as Compton, West Adams, or even Crenshaw. White resistance came just as quickly by homeowners doing everything in their power to stop, if not limit, black upward mobility into their neighborhood by burning crosses, bombing, causing vandalism, and even threatening them with death. One person wrote to California Governor Earl Warren saying, quote, in southern states, they have laws that keep the nigger in their places. But unfortunately, for the white race in this state, there is nothing to control them, unquote. It is important to note that not all white Comptonites held such racist beliefs, and some social activists even bought houses in Compton and quickly flipped them, reselling them to African Americans without a profit. But this was a minority. White homeowners often feared the devaluation of their properties if their neighbors sold to black families, even going as far as threatening their white neighbors if they attempted such action. In fact, this would help spur the white flight of the late 1960s and 1970s, which is critical in understanding our story of how many New Deal Democrats shifted their political alliances to the Republican Party. And quickly, I just want to show you some pictures here. This is Compton Elementary School in 1951. As you can see, mostly looks like it's all Anglo-American. And it was one of the best schools in Los Angeles at that time. And then down below, again, you see mostly Anglo-Americans in Compton, kind of getting ready for the Christmas celebrations. So it's funny how these cities look very different today. So a quick note before we move forward, I just want to remind you about how these political affiliations with Republican and Democrat are changing from decade to decade, more or less. So if we look at Republican today, it is nothing like a Republican from, say, the Reconstruction era or from the Great Depression or even the 1960s or even the 80s. So I want you to understand that these political affiliations are evolving with the times, and we're looking at that history of how what it means to be Democrat, what it means to be Republican is changing throughout the 1950s and 60s all the way into the 80s. All right, so keep that in mind. So as noted earlier, labor unions were instrumental in developing our modern notion of the American dream and the middle class, with a house in the suburbs, a car, a white picket fence, and the 2.7 kids that the wife needed to take care of, along with her household chores. Again, that's the American dream. It was an ideal time if you were a middle class white male. So the belief is that they had all the material wealth. However, research has shown that even they were just as miserable as anyone else living in this 1950s gilded cage that they constructed. So in case you want visual, you can watch a show like Mad Men, and there you see how even middle-class white males are miserable and hence they're having all these affairs, right? So let's continue. So how did these New Deal Democrats change in their political alliances from the party that provided the material culture that they sought? Remember that these 1950s middle-class white men and women came of age during the Great Depression where they had nothing, so living out in suburbia gave them a sense of accomplishment, particularly because they believed that, quote, they worked hard for what they got, unquote. And again, let me remind you that much of this material wealth that they got was the product of federal spending, particularly in places like the West. So a good example of that would be a city like Pasadena. There's so much federal spending in the kind of aerospace area that it built that city. During the Great Depression, Republicans had more or less accepted the fact that government played an important role in managing the nation, along with the economy, particularly because it was the Republican Party's policies of the 1920s that caused the Depression. In 1936, Republicans chose a, quote, progressive Midwestern governor, Alfred Landon of Kansas, to battle FDR, unquote, for the presidency with a platform that supported many federal policies such as old age and unemployment payments, protecting the rights of labor to organize and bargain collectively, endorsed state minimum wage and hour laws for women and children, because as Landon argued, quote, as civilization becomes more complex, government must increase, unquote. This trend continued with the selection of Thomas Dewey in the 1940s, who was a progressive from New York, and even both Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon didn't threaten the New Deal policy. So essentially, there was a consensus amongst both Democrats and Republicans that government played an important role, right? This is part of the reason why we haven't had a Great Depression. As you have seen throughout the semester, prior to 1929, there's recession after recession after recession. So what changed? Well, Republicans, for the most part, had accepted the role of government played in people's lives, providing safety nets when times were tough. However, in the 1950s and the early 60s, the middle class had grown to nearly 70%. So many of these mostly white middle class workers questioned the function of government now that the times were not tough anymore, at least not for them. So it was Arizona's very own Senator Barry Goldwater that helped create this political divide when he was first elected senator and stated, quote, well, I am not a Me Too Republican. I am a Republican opposed to the superstate and to the gigantic bureaucratic centralized authority, unquote. Note that this is during the age of McCarthyism, where anything that had a hint of socialism, such as old age Social Security, medical care, unemployment benefits, public housing projects, and federal aid for education, were seen as a threat to some generic idea of quote-unquote freedom. However, Republicans were cautious of optics, so the little that they did support gave the illusion of democracy's dominance over communism. In fact, Goldwater often voted against Eisenhower's legislation about 50% of the time during Eisenhower's tenure, which Eisenhower's policies favored federal aid to education, doubling the rate of immigration, a medical care program, and extensive civil rights legislation. And Eisenhower hoped to help labor win the closed shop agreements, basically kind of following FDR. As the decade came to a close, Goldwater's ticket had risen, particularly after he published his book, The Consciousness of a Conservative, which mimicked much of Calvin Coolidge's principles of limited government, even though Goldwater himself favored certain federal centralized power with a, quote, strong military and the expansion of federal powers, especially those of the FBI, unquote. So, what did Goldwater stand for? He reprised a very Western ideal of the forgotten man that was, quote, diligent, dutiful, religious, middle class American who was being penalized by paternalists in Washington who redistributed their incomes to deprive Americans and, more importantly, to citizens speaking through powerful interests, unquote. This rugged individualism was rooted in the West, where they advocated for less distribution of resources and lower public spending, lower property tax rates, and the belief that hard work would bring economic success. In other words, each man earned his own. Yet they forgot how important government was to their success by building things like dams, providing land, federal spending in, again, the aerospace industry, funding of economic enterprise, etc., etc. There's the conundrum, right? By 1962, the split from the progressive Republicans was set, and the new platform was centered on their, quote, rejection of compromise, the dismantling of New Deal laws rather than proposing new legislation, and the obliteration of the welfare state, unquote, as one can clearly see when he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the end, the election of 1964, where Goldwater battled Johnson, was anticlimactic, as Senator Goldwater lost the presidency and actually lost votes for the Republican Party. He even lost Vermont, which was unheard of at the time, and cost the party seats in the legislative branch at the national and the state level with limited success in southern states. However, as one Goldwater assistant argued, quote, I know we probably won't win in November, unquote, but as Theodore White noted, he saw this defeat as a victory, not for the executive seat, but rather of an ideology that would set the tone for the coming decades. And this picture is kind of key because here you see Goldwater, right? But then over here at this end, you see a very important party that will basically mimic much of Goldwater's ideas, and that's Ronald Reagan. So again, I want you to picture yourself living in 1964 and seeing how America was changing. We covered this in the previous chapters when you guys looked at civil rights and all these different groups that were advocating for, basic freedoms, basic rights, and there's a reaction to that, right? So here we're going to examine that reaction against some of those policies and some of those movements that were happening. So with centrist Republicans now being pushed to the side, a new Republican Party emerged in the post-1964 presidential election, which now gravitated against many of LBJ's policies. But they needed someone to carry the torch from Senator Goldwater, no pun intended here. In came Alabama's George Wallace, who, for the most part of the 1950s, was liberal on economic issues and a moderate on race, at least by Southern standards, okay? However, a hard loss to John Patterson in June of 1958 changed his political course, where he dreaded his concession speech and told a group of close friends, quote, well, boys, no other son of a bitch will ever out-nigger me again, unquote. One of the first times the nation gets a glimpse of Wallace was in 1963, where he blocked the entrance of 2 black students to the University of Alabama. You see that right here. With the news press catching every moment, it became clear that actions were more powerful than the words. When pictures and short television clips captured the nation's attention of Wallace standing at the front of the school against an, quote, illegal usurpation of power by the central government, unquote, what most people forget is that within 2 hours, the National Guard came in and Wallace actually backed down and returned home. But what the media did And what 78 million viewers saw was the elevation of a visual of a defiant governor who utilized the lost cause argument of state versus federal rights, where Wallace claimed that the North, quote, all hate black people, all of them. They're afraid, all of them. Great God, that's it. They're Southerners. The whole U.S. is Southern, unquote. This seemed to embolden Wallace, and in a time where the press protected private conversations from leaking, Wallace presented himself as someone that cared about, quote, tradition, values, and local control, unquote. Yet privately harboring racist beliefs that could be used for a national run. He often noted that African Americans were criminally predisposed and were prone to commit the most, quote, outrageous acts of humanity, such as rape, assault, and murder, unquote. These feelings reflected the national consciousness, as many Americans felt that the federal government was moving too fast in pushing for integration. For example, in 1963, only about 31% had this feeling of the government moving too fast. But by 1968, those numbers jumped to 50%. When his presidential run got off the ground, the majority of his donors were not right-wing elites who did not seem to take him seriously, but rather low and middle income Americans who mailed $10 to $20 contributions to the quote unquote Wallace campaign, indicating that he was one of them, particularly due to his quote country background and his lack of polish and sophistication, unquote. He took this persona that had been constructed through the media and raged against what he and white working and middle class Americans saw as a change where civil rights agitators and anti-war demonstrators were, quote, a symptom of a fundamental decline in traditional culture compass of God, family, and country. A decline reflected in rising crime rates, the legalization of abortion, the rise in out-of-wedlock pregnancies, the increase in divorce rates, and the proliferation of obscene literature and films, unquote. All the while, African Americans moving beyond their, quote, safely encapsulated ghettos and into our streets, our schools, our neighborhoods, unquote. This rhetoric of them versus us allowed him to fully capture the sentiment of white America and portray them as victims that were betrayed by their government, hoping to focus and channel their anger against the, quote, intellectual snobs and the briefcase-carrying bureaucrats, unquote. While running for president in 1968, his rallies and speeches were often incoherent and disconnected ramblings, hoping to frighten his audience, all the while exuding a sexual undertone of a rock star with 70,000 people waiting in line at the Boston Commons, hoping to get a glimpse of him. Note that this is in the North, where many believe he had little support. People would chant while patriotic music played in the background as he threw kisses to the crowd. His rhetoric was one that glorified violence, but against those that he felt were the enemy of the U.S. And the crowd seemed to eat it all up, with Richard Strout, a columnist of the New Republic, watching in horror, noting that it brought chilling reminders of 1930s Germany. Though he lost the election of 1968, the conservative movement had found their champion, particularly those white males from the ages of 18 to 35 that felt disenfranchised and alienated and hoped to return the U.S. back to their quote-unquote traditional values. So there's also research on conservative women, and I actually do cover that, but in my women's history class. So you're welcome to take that class in case you're interested. This once French movement was now becoming mainstream, and if the Republican Party had any hope to succeed, it needed to take them into account and codify their needs. So I quickly want to show you a clip that addresses the policies of Wallace when he ran for office.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bussed across town.
As president, I shall, within the law, turn back the absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Open a little business and see what might happen.
As president, I will stand up for your local police and firemen in protecting your safety and property.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Watch your hard-earned tax dollars sail away to anti-American countries.
As president, I will halt the giveaway of your American dollars and products to those nations that aid our enemies.
Wallace has the courage to stand up for America. Give him your support.
So as noted earlier, right, this notion of fear becomes the cornerstone of the Republican Party in the late 60s into the 70s. So let's examine this, what has been defined, I think Richard Nixon called it, the silent majority. What does this mean? So with the success of civil rights legislation of the 1960s, Republicans went on the attack against these policies. In the previous decade, in the 1960s, many white voters saw the political uprising out in the streets with walkouts, with strikes, marches, riots, etc. However, for Nixon, he recognized that those with real political power were not out in the streets protesting, but rather made their voices heard at the ballot boxes. Hence, he defined these conservatives as a silent majority, which was the critical voting bloc of his support. In fact, Wallace had such a major impact, even though he only received about 1 out of 8 votes, that Richard Nixon got to work right away after his inauguration to gain those Wallace supporters. For him, for Nixon, it was all about perception rather than reality. One of Nixon's media advisors summarized it perfectly, stating, "Voters are basically lazy, basically uninterested in making an effort to understand what we're talking about. Reason requires a high degree of discipline, of concentration. The emotions are more easily roused, closer to the surface, more malleable. It's the aura that surrounds the charismatic figure more than it is the figure itself. That draws the follower. Our task is to build that aura," unquote. His speechwriter, Raymond Price, followed up by saying, quote, "For most voters, the decision to support a candidate was a gut reaction, inarticulated, non-analytical, a product of the particular chemistry between the voter and the image of the candidate. It's not what's there that counts, but rather what is projected." So basically, both of them are saying it doesn't really matter what they believe or what they stand for, because the voter is too lazy to really kind of comprehend what they're talking about, right? Particularly deep, complicated issues, right? So it's more about exciting the public about getting support for these candidates. So in other words, for voters, policies didn't seem to matter anymore, and they seemed to gravitate towards someone that personified some sort of cult of personality, rather than understanding actual policy. Unfortunately, Nixon lacked charisma and even a political ideology, which seemed to follow much of the older Republicans that I talked about earlier that supported the role of government. However, he was preparing for the next presidential cycle by making sure that another third party, like Wallace, would not threaten his re-election effort. Unlike Goldwater and Wallace, though, Nixon did not really stand for anything. His positions on race and integration were inept, to say the least. While speaking to a Southern Senator congregation, quote, he declared himself in favor of desegregation but against integration, meaning that he opposed any policies that would actually bring about a mixing of the races in schools or neighborhoods, unquote. In fact, although he recognized that he needed the support of white middle-class Americans, he proposed policies that were actually progressive and countered neoconservative ideas. For example, in his major television address of August 1969, Nixon proposed the Family Assistance Plan, a nationalized welfare program that would offer a minimum standard of living in return for a work commitment, which would compensate to both single mothers along with families with fathers living at home, unquote. This would benefit all Americans, but one key group it hoped to target would be African Americans in order for them to reach out of the depths of poverty. It was a daring plan, sort of like the Great Society program, that would add 3 million Americans to the welfare rolls and would cost an additional $4 billion in just the first year, and future costs would not be known. In addition, Nixon created the, quote, Office of Minority Enterprises to promote black capitalism and back the beginning of a so-called set-aside programs, which require that a fixed percentage of government contracts be guaranteed to minority businesses, unquote. Though his programs got attacked from both sides of the political aisle, many felt that this was an assault on the forgotten American, which were defined as white middle class and working class. These quote-unquote forgotten Americans were not concerned with poverty, and although they saw the lawlessness on their evening news, they were more concerned with middle-class African Americans moving into their neighborhood, particularly because they were purchasing homes on the fringes of those white communities. The Family Assistance Plan stalled in Congress and eventually drifted away with little fanfare, and Nixon did not even seem to care. If we revisit our case study of Compton, we see this happening as middle-class African Americans were, quote, willing to pay more for homes in Compton than whites. Some white homeowners quickly sold to the aspiring black suburbanites, unquote. This was not the ghettoization of Compton, but rather the emergence of the American dream for African Americans, with many white observers noting how well African Americans took care of their homes, as one stated that, quote, black neighbors are stable. In our neighborhood, they are a good class. Many buy their homes and take good care of them. We wouldn't exchange Compton for any other place, unquote. While another observer arguing, quote, of course they're moving into our city, and there's nothing legal we can do to stop it. But you'll be surprised. I'll take you through some of the streets they took over, clean as anything you want to see, unquote. These exceptions shadow the reality of what white middle-class Americans felt in Nixon's re-election campaign. Quote, recognize the critical role that white fears would play in guaranteeing the emerging Republican majority. In fact, in a somewhat Machiavellian plot, Kevin Phillips, who worked for Nixon, encouraged Republicans to increase black Southern voting rights because, as he argued, this would benefit the Republican Party with Southern whites seeing the increase in black political participation and causing white voters to leave the Democratic Party in droves. The goal was to make race a wedge issue, particularly because the Democratic Party was now associated with social issues, which to white Americans seemed to cater to African Americans rather than to them, the forgotten American. It was a political strategy that centered on getting new voters, particularly New Deal Democrats, that benefited from federal programs of the 1930s, but were now resentful that others were reaping a few of those benefits, i.e. African Americans. In fact, Nixon set in motion a strategy to, quote, go after the Poles, the Italians, the Irish, as they must learn to understand the silent majority. Don't go for Jews and blacks, unquote. By 1972, Nixon and the Republican Party had abandoned any sense of progressivism or even moderate policies as they, quote, emphasized Nixon's commitment to containing welfare costs, his opposition to busing, to quotas, and affirmative action. And they continued hammering away at the theme that the Democratic Party was out of touch with mainstream values in American society, unquote. After a few private meetings between Nixon and George Wallace, Wallace opted to run for president again, but not as a Republican candidate or a third party, but as a Democrat, hoping to sabotage the success of any Democratic nominee. However, eventually Wallace got shot, and he seemed to lose his luster. With Wallace no longer a threat to Nixon, 1972 cemented the realignment of Goldwater's crusade, with Nixon able to pull New Deal Democrats, both ethnic and blue-collar workers, into the GOP, along with Southern Dixiecrats. This silent majority was not protesting in public spaces, but rather making their voices heard through their vote, particularly when it came to issues that hit home, as we see with the desegregation of schools. So here you see some pictures of again, the silent majority. I mean, here they actually are protesting because they wanted to win the war in Vietnam, and Nixon was like trying to pull out. And here you see another example that I mentioned earlier, right, with the Compton example of somebody who's middle class African American. He's a doctor trying to move into a middle class white neighborhood, and these people are not having it. Many of us, even historians, have seen 1954's Brown versus the Board of Education as one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history, and even as a catalyst to the civil rights movement that was right around the corner. And although it is significant, the case lacked any real power or even a plan on how to accomplish the desegregation and integration of white and black students. This case is somewhat of a case study of how it helped fuel the rise of conservatism. When Brown v. Board nullified separate but equal Jim Crow education, it set a quick backlash from not only the South, but throughout the United States, particularly when busing was implemented. As some of you might be aware, busing was seen as the best option to not only desegregate, but also integrate schools in order to create an equal playing field. In 1973, the Supreme Court case Keyes v. Denver School District No. 1 played an important litmus test to see if such a program could actually work. In case you are wondering, this is what busing did. It took African American students from their community and bused them into white suburban schools that had better educational resources. What brought the controversy was that in order to create an equilibrium of students, they took white students from these suburban communities and bused them to inner city schools. Hence, this is what brought the conflict. In fact, white flight had created a new form of de facto segregation that was not so much rooted on Jim Crow laws anymore, but rather on subtle racist actions of this new conservative movement that opted to move away from people of color. Their communities were newer, cleaner, modern, and better funded, since much of the school funding came from local taxes. Thus, they had the better schools. However, not all white people could move deeper into the suburbs, so Boston encompassed a division of busing clearer than any other city. Though white flight caused a major population shift, many white working class people remained within the city limits and were resentful that they had to participate in the busing program in this kind of new experiment, particularly because they pay local taxes for local schools where their children should have attended. As buses brought black students from outside neighborhoods into white working class communities, people began to throw stones, and African American students were harassed and even assaulted. White students rejected the notion of having to attend black schools, so many parents pulled their kids from the school system and put them in private schools, many into Catholic schools. Ultimately, what we find is that racist attitudes governed the new conservative movement, but it was coded in a new language that hid it by using terms like local schools, anti-busing, and states' rights. So down here, this is in California, in Los Angeles, where communities are protesting again this busing program. It was happening again all over the United States in places like Pasadena was a great example of that. And up here, I'm going to show you a video clip that examines what happened in this particular situation. But this is in Boston, which I just kind of talked about, where people were, harassing the African American students, or pulling their kids from the school. PBS does a great documentary. It's like a 2-hour documentary on this event. So I'll show you a small clip, particularly that is specific to this picture because it's so kind of ironic, right? Where this guy is using the American flag to hurt an African American person here, right? So again, the video will explain that.
I was walking across City Hall Plaza on my way to attend a meeting in City Hall. I realized that there was an anti-busing demonstration going on. Several of them started shouting, "There's a nigger, get him." The first person to attack me knocked my glasses off, and that caused me to fall. And then several other young men decided to start kicking me. I was able to pick myself up, and I could see that someone was swinging an American flag at me, really lunging at me with the flag.
I see this all happening, and I remember crying and saying, why is this happening? Because when you did these peaceful marches, you don't want people to think of us as, here come the troublemakers.
That evening, I got a call from the Boston police saying that a photographer had captured the incident, and they wanted me to see whether I could identify any of the young people. That was the first moment that I really got to see the expressions on the faces of these teenagers. It was clear that there was manifest hatred that several of the young men felt towards me.
The Pulitzer Prize winning photograph became the world famous emblem of hatred. The American flag, a black professional walking through City Hall Plaza, and the violence that was inflicted upon him as a result of hatred.
So let's examine the Reagan Revolution. The culmination of new conservatism must address Ronald Reagan as he helped bring very pluralistic communities such as evangelicals, the Catholics, the anti-tax, the pro-family and anti-abortion, the anti-social issues, along with a few others, under the umbrella of the GOP. Though careful not to use overt racist language like other American presidents, what made Ronald Reagan unique was the way coded racism was so easily understood by his supporters, as though they were speaking their own language, particularly linking almost any social issues to African Americans. For example, when mentioning affirmative action, the majority of them believed that this was a handout to an unqualified black person, when in reality, white women were the largest benefactors of this program, a fact that most Americans seem to forget. However, Reagan and the New Right didn't seem to care of these facts, as Reagan was able to communicate this message to his supporters without using racial rhetoric. Now here's the odd thing about Reagan. Many of us have historical amnesia when we discuss Reagan, partly because he has such a powerful presence during his tenure as president. He was someone that the federal government literally lifted up by the bootstraps, as his, quote, alcoholic father lost his job as a shoe salesman during the Great Depression, and the family was saved from total destitution by New Deal relief programs, unquote. In other words, he was saved by the federal government. Reagan's father took charge of the local Work Progress Administration branch in Illinois, and Reagan often referred to FDR as his idol, supporting many of his programs. So what changed? Some have credited Nancy Reagan, his wife, with this epiphany. However, it was during his time working as a spokesman for General Electric where the business elite shaped his perspective on any form of collectivism, quote, often condemning the government as an impediment to profit and thus, by metaphorical extension, as a dangerous step towards socialism, unquote. However, let's not forget that the federal government was giving millions of dollars to companies such as GE. So they were not complaining about that part. During his time as president of the Screen Actors Guild in the 1940s, he attacked anyone or anything that had a hint of socialism. During the Hollywood blacklist period, he became a confidential informant for the FBI, seeking out liberal and communist people in Hollywood and then linking these two concepts of liberal and communism together as a national threat. During the 1964 presidential election, the U.S. got a glimpse of Ronald Reagan on national television where he gave a speech that cemented his support of not only Goldwater, but his principles of small government. In fact, he saw government as, quote, inherently dangerous, unquote, to the American way of life. This would give rise to his stock, and he became governor of California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. First, Reagan was the first president to be elected for 2 full terms and served the entire time, all 8 years, since the election of Dwight Eisenhower. So his tenure did capture the public imagination. Unlike Jimmy Carter and all the problems that encompass his tenure, such as inflation, the gas crisis, and the Iranian hostage crisis, Reagan provided an optimistic message challenging the economic disasters of the 1970s. His vision reflected this nostalgia Americans had of the 1950s with phrases such as, "Let's make America great again," unquote, indicating that he wanted to return to the Pax Americana. In addition, he provided an alternative and the fulfillment of what Barry Goldwater promised, which was, quote, less government, lower taxes, renewed military might, and traditional social values that appealed to the business sector and evangelicals, unquote. Reagan was a very charismatic speaker, often speaking in a tone that seemed to connect with you. Instead of reading his speeches, he would often memorize them, delivering them in a soothing baritone voice, which comforted the masses, particularly in trying times. I still remember watching him on TV and feeling like he was speaking directly to me. However, his biggest challenge was how he was going to fix the economy. As you recall from the reading, Americans have gone through an economic shift in the 1970s. With Nixon beginning good relations with China, it set the tone of American offshore manufacturing, which would provide short-term gains for American consumers, but have long-term losses, creating a post-industrial economy, hurting labor unions and the American worker. In fact, the, quote, greed is good, greed is right, greed works mantra of the 1980s, which comes from the film Wall Street, also reflected the priorities of manufacturing, with GE CEO Jack Welch noting that, quote, corporations owe their primary allegiances to stockholders, not employees, unquote. Corporate takeovers and mergers contributed to this free market mindset to put profit over people, often using junk bonds to finance these takeovers. In turn, all these profits, while they lasted, would help young yuppies buy BMW cars, Perrier water, along with other exclusive material things that people did not really need. I still recall the commercials of the era of the 1980s that reflected this mindset, such as Grey Poupon. And it was funny, if you ever seen Grey Poupon commercials, I think there's 2 Rolls Royce cars pulling up to each other asking for Grey Poupon. And to us, that was a luxury. It was meant for a higher economic group. So our parents never bought it because we thought we were not classy enough to have mustard. And you also have shows such as The Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and another show named Dynasty that reflected the opulent lifestyles that we dreamed to emulate. This might remind you of the Gilded Age, 100 years before, with many of the robber barons having the same philosophy. If you remember, right, them throwing these big parties, giving Tiffany as, party gifts and stuff like that. However, globalization made it impossible for Americans to compete with third world cheap labor. So those jobs that were leaving in the 1970s and 80s were never coming back. Another factor that impacted the Reagan administration was the rise of the computer-driven economy, which, to conservatives, proved that faith in the capitalist free enterprise would replace those jobs that were lost in manufacturing. The Sun Belt, places like Florida, Texas, and California, flourished, but unfortunately, these were high-tech industries, which industrial workers just lacked the skills to enter. So it wasn't easy for them to go from manufacturing to this new industry. Lastly, even the religious right, such as Pat Robertson's, Jerry Falwell, and Jimmy and Tammy Faye Baker, followed this prosperity theology, with televangelists taking Christianity, packaging it through their televisions directly to consumer, earning them millions of dollars for themselves while supporting Reagan's attack against 1960s policies. So when Reagan entered the presidency, his positive message of America and his economic policies aligned with this new political and mental shift. Reaganomics, as it became known, promised more than what it could actually deliver, though. As he tried to emulate the policies of the 1920s, supply-side economics in the 1980s differed significantly, though it maintained some core principles. Reagan worked to lower taxes, deregulate businesses, and cut federal support for unions. As you may recall from the lecture on the 1920s, the goal of cutting taxes was to promote business, to use those funds and reinvest them, creating more jobs and producing more goods and services. In doing so, more people would seek those goods and purchase them, creating new tax revenues, offsetting the tax cuts. And the theory is that it would actually bring in more tax revenue due to all the American spending. As one of his first orders of business, he signed the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, cutting federal income taxes 5% the first year and 10% each of the next 2 years. By the end of the 1980s, only the rich earned and kept more of the income, with the majority of Americans facing economic stagflation. For example, in 1980, there were 29 million Americans living under the poverty line, but just 10 years later, that number grew to 37 million. If you recall the lecture on Harding and Coolidge, they not only cut taxes, but they also cut costs, which is something that Reagan failed to do. First, he attacked regulations because he believed it hurt economic growth, which again follows the 1920 supply-side theory. Budgets for OSHA were cut, the administrators did not tend to enforce the rules that were in place, and Reagan allowed timber and mining companies to exploit wilderness areas and for oil companies to drill off the Pacific coast. He even pressed Congress to deregulate the saving and loans industry, which lacked any government oversight, and allowed bankers to invest their depositors' money in speculative investment, which later forced H.W. Bush in 1989, when he became president, to basically bail them out at a great cost to taxpayers instead of going into a deep recession. So the policies from the 80s impacted, the next president. Lastly, Reagan attacked labor unions, which is ironic because not only was he a product of a union, but he also led the Screen Actors Guild. Regardless, he saw them as impeding his goal, so when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, PATCO, went on strike to fight against unsafe conditions in the air traffic control system, which is very important to do, Reagan fired them all and replaced them with non-union workers, giving businesses the support to do the same with their union workers. This quote-unquote voodoo economic policy, as George H.W. Bush called it, never really trickled down either in the 1920s or in the 1980s, and it did cause a short recession in the early 1980s, as the textbook argued. In fact, as much as Reagan tried to emulate the 1920s, he actually increased the federal debt significantly from $994 billion in 1981 to $2.6 trillion by 1988. Much of it caused due to the failed Strategic Defense Initiative, which was also known as Star Wars, where he used the American credit card to outspend the Russians, hoping that it would bankrupt their nation, which to some extent actually worked. Other programs cost the U.S. a lot of money to preserve, and they had become such staples that cutting them would become political suicide. For example, he wanted to cut both Medicare and Social Security, two very costly programs. However, these programs were too popular, and most Americans believe that they paid into one, so particularly older Americans who tend to vote. So many Americans saw them as entitlements and were not willing to let those go. The best government could do was increase the age of obtaining full benefits from 65 years old to 67. The chapter in the textbook goes deeper into many of these facts, such as Black Monday, when the market lost 23% of its value in one day. So if you've seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, those first couple, maybe 15, 20 minutes, shows you a nice visual of what took place. However, what this showed to particularly Reagan was that he could not continue spending without consequences. However, for all his missteps and scandals that his administration faced, such as the Iran-Contra affair, if the book talked about this is where Oliver North pretty much protected Reagan so he didn't get impeached. He remained very popular and was even dubbed the Teflon president because nothing seemed to go back to him, making him immune from prosecution. In addition, his speeches seemed to capture the public imagination, particularly when he addressed the USSR to, quote, open this gate, tear down this wall, unquote, referring to the Berlin Wall, which eventually did come down a few years later. By focusing on an outside enemy, the Russians, it allowed Reagan to gain support for his policies domestically, allowing him to cut social programs. There were many speeches that he gave, and in this next one, it is directly tied to the way race and conservatism kind of merged together in a kind of coded way. Certain programs were easier to attack, particularly because they were seen as undeserving, which Reagan was able to exploit. As noted earlier, white working and middle-class men felt as though they had been forgotten, so they began to argue that they also face racial discrimination due to government policy. A perfect example of this, quote-unquote, reverse discrimination is the Bakke case, which eliminated quotas for affirmative action, as white Americans believed the myth that unqualified African Americans were getting positions that were beyond their ability. Again, white women were the biggest benefactors of affirmative action. This continued under the Reagan administration as he sought to cut social welfare programs to push his quote-unquote less government ideology, which he often linked welfare with African Americans, without actually even using the term, like black or African Americans. This new form of coded racism was well known in conservative circles because of the way race and welfare had been discussed over the previous 30 to 40 years. For example, when it came to welfare, most Americans in the 1980s assumed that blacks outnumbered other communities that were on the welfare rolls. In fact, politicians and the press would often hammer this hyperbole image to their constituents when in reality, African American families accounted for less than 39% of the welfare population, with most having no more than 2 children, not 5 or 6, with about 50% working while on the program, and many were on these programs an average of 2 years, not a lifetime. However, none of these facts would matter as people did not make political decisions based on fact and logic, but with feeling and emotions, as it was previously noted in the lecture, right, as I noted with Nixon. The Reagan administration would often promote ideas of, quote, welfare queens from Chicago who were living off the public resources while hardworking people were grappling with the hyperinflation and the gasoline shortages of the Carter administration, unquote. Or the fictitious food stamp recipient, quote, who was able to buy T-bone steaks while most middle-class Americans struggled to put hamburger on the table, unquote. So what Reagan did here during his 1976 run for the presidency was use an isolated story of professional criminal Martha Miller, also known as Linda Taylor, who used multiple aliases to defraud many state agencies, along with private individuals, as an example of this overall corruption, even though it was an extreme case. She was actually classified as white, believe it or not. not black. But through her criminal career, her identity often shifted and was labeled Jewish, mixed, African American, and even Filipina. However, none of this mattered since welfare had become so racialized with African Americans, and people already believed that there was major fraud in welfare programs, even though as a collective there was not. Such perceptions of sectors of the population made it easy to gut these programs, and Reagan, quote, cut funds for low-income federal housing programs by 84%. Such attacks on social programs using this new coded language allowed most Americans, even those that needed and utilized these programs, to support the gutting of these resources that they themselves often use, because they saw them as undeserving. Even though a large portion of the people that use things like welfare were white working class people, thus showing how people would often vote against their own interests when language was utilized to construe the fictitious narrative. Hence, new conservatism was now defined, and the Reagan Revolution was seen as a success for this rhetoric, as this rhetoric will continue to be used in the late 1980s and 1990s with a Willie Horton political ad that helped get George H.W. Bush elected, or with a contract with America, where they started cutting welfare benefits. And you have to remember, like in places like West Virginia, there's a lot of poverty there, mostly white, because the coal industry began to leave as we live in the post-industrial economy in the 1980s. So a lot of times they were, again, kind of hurting themselves because these programs, these cuts were across the board. So the contract with America would cut a lot of these welfare benefits, and it also helped portray Democrats as, quote, out of touch with fundamental American values, unquote. And they saw the Democratic Party as the, quote, party of blacks, of homosexuals, of the undeserving poor, of the big spending bureaucrat defenders of the welfare state, and of those unwilling to defend American interests abroad, unquote. Indeed, this plan worked as Americans in the late 1980s, quote, instinctively believed that the black community was marked by higher rates of crime and illegitimacy, a weakened family structure, low achievements in educational levels, and greater demands on the welfare system, unquote. Now, we see this in different ways, particularly in the 1990s. All we have to do is look at the very kind of flawed study of Herrnstein and Murray called the bell curve, which argued that liberal policies and intellectuals had conspired to conceal the uncomfortable reality that generically inherited IQ limited the capabilities of some racial and ethnic groups, unquote. In other words, due to this particular study, the bell curve, it was now believed that racial minorities were inferior to previous ethnic whites, such as the Italians, the Polish, the Irish, the Greek, the Germans, who migrated in the early 20th century. Which is odd because if you can recall that period, they use all these same concepts against these, ethnic whites during the, late 1890s into the early 20th century. As Reagan left office with a high approval rating, most conservatives had a form of collective amnesia that forgot about the massive tax cuts, Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign that was costly and an utter failure against the drug epidemic, and enormous military spending that had detrimental economic consequences with such government spending. Unlike President Warren Harding in the 1920s, who tried to cut costs, President Ronald Reagan did not have the political leverage or the policy know-how to implement supply-side economic policies, partly because he didn't control the legislative, at least the GOP didn't control the legislative, but also he didn't have that cachet to convince them of cutting some of these programs. All right, but again, Social Security and Medicare. And anyway, a theory like supply-side economics, Reaganomics, voodoo economics, had been outdated and was not practical for this new modern economy. I quickly want to show you these pictures. This one is the DARE program. I went through this program when I was a kid. I think I was in fifth grade or something like that. I still remember it. And it was interesting because, the whole point was just say no to drugs. The blame was always put on the person that brought the drugs and never on the person who consumed them. So this program was to try to convince kids, and again, we were just kids at the time, no older than 9, 10 years old, to stay off drugs, right? Kind of like in the long term. And it was kind of cool because we got a lot of swag. The government spent a lot of money on stickers, on pins, on hats, I remember. And, a lot of photo ops were happening. And this is a great example of that with Nancy Reagan promoting it around my area in Rosewood Elementary School in California. So this is a famous quote by George Bush, where when he became president, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And he's trying to follow what Reagan was doing, and he was a critic of Reagan when both of them were running for president in 1980. He's the one who called Reaganomics, voodoo economics, but George Bush ended up becoming president. So the irony of all this is that the very policies that Reagan passed in the 1980s ended up hurting the American white working class. As mentioned earlier, deindustrialization, weaker unions, deregulation, military overspending, and tax cuts helped spur the recession of the early 1990s. George H.W. Bush, who was a pragmatist, tried to follow his predecessor's policies, but lacked the charisma to charm his way out of fiscal reality. With the USSR no longer a threat, Bush had no boogeyman to use as a scapegoat. He did try to find one as gas prices increased and Iraq attacked Kuwait, but it only lasted a few months. Though the Gulf War and Operation Desert Storm did catapult Bush's presidential approval above 80%, I think some even say it's close to 90%. It quickly dwindled with the recession of the early 1990s. Bush had no choice but to raise taxes due to his predecessor's overspending and fiscal mistakes. As it was noted in this lecture and in the textbook, the policies and overspending of Reaganomics cost Bush the 1992 election to Bill Clinton, who, like Reagan, was very in tune with a new generation, as he was the first baby boomer to be elected president. So let's conclude this lecture. We covered a lot of years, right, from the 1960s to the 1980s, and we saw the rise of conservatism and how that all took shape. In the 1960s, we see Barry Goldwater help define this notion of conservatism. And one thing that I want you to walk out with is understanding how these political ideologies are always shifting. So to be a Republican today is nothing like being a Republican, say, during the Reagan period, or being Republican during Lincoln's period, right? It's almost complete opposite to some extent. And the same goes with being Democrat, right? So being a Democrat today is nothing like being a Democrat back in the 1960s or 30s or definitely not in the late 1800s. So that is a key point that I wanted to get across to you, to show you how there's realignment and there's shifts happening with these political parties and how they implement different political philosophies into their ideologies. So in the 1960s, it's really Barry Goldwater. I mean, you could almost pinpoint it to some extent, right? Our Arizona senator that helped shape the conservative era from 1960s forward. We also try to show you how race becomes an important element in shaping this ideology, right? As the 1950s, we have this era of economic prosperity, which we call the Pax Americana. As political figures begin to give voice to marginalized communities, there is this kind of backlash against that. So these Democrats, what we define as New Deal Democrats, who were okay with kind of like the power of the federal government making these changes, particularly when it benefited them, all of a sudden begin to switch political allegiances to the conservative movement because they saw that their world was changing, particularly in the 1960s, right, with civil rights movements and the anti-war war movement, and just that Supreme Court cases that were, at least the way they felt, was going against them. So they begin to use this kind of coded race language, just depending on who you're talking about. As we saw George Wallace didn't really hide it, though he definitely used certain language to associate certain policies with certain ethnic groups, right, or racial groups. And that all comes to the culmination of the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan has become a big political figure. If you're a Republican, he's almost reached the status of sainthood to some extent, right? So what we see with Ronald Reagan is trying to implement policies that not only were popular in the 1920s, but really we see him giving fruition to what Goldwater hoped to accomplish in the 1960s. And he had, a lot of success with it. He is one of the most popular, one of the most recognizable presidents in American history. You talk about Washington, you talk about Lincoln, and you also talk about Reagan, right? There's certain presidents that we've had that most of us probably don't really remember anymore. And, even though he tried to implement supply side economics and, policies that were, at least economic theories that were already outdated, it still showed that they were kind of promoting this smaller government, right? And even though it might have a negative impact, as we see with George H.W. Bush when he became president, right? It all came back and bit him pretty hard with the economic recession and ended up costing him the election. But another kind of key point that we addressed about Reagan is the way race was used. Not so much overtly, but very coded with terms like we see concepts of reverse discrimination. We see ideas of welfare queens, obviously being associated with African Americans. And, people voting for these policies when it, to some extent, might have even hurt them. So a good example of that is, as I mentioned earlier, we live in a post-industrial economy in the 1980s, and you have many of these people voting against policies that would have benefited them because many of them don't have, the high-tech skills to enter certain job sectors. So these programs that were established to temporarily benefit them, they're actually voting against them now. So that, we see the 1980s is a culmination of that. So I want to end this with these two pictures here. Here, there's a biopic coming out of Ronald Reagan, and I believe this is a very kind of positive view on Ronald Reagan. Like I said, he's become somewhat of a saint in the Republican Party. So in case you're interested, I do want to highlight that. As of this moment, it's going to be released fairly soon. I'm sure there's trailers out there. And it probably does give a very positive portrayal of Ronald Reagan. The second one is a show called Them. So this show is on Amazon Prime, and it addresses what I addressed at the beginning of this lecture with African Americans moving into white suburban communities in Los Angeles. As it was noted during the Wallace section, that in the South, African Americans, quote unquote, knew their place, right? But as they move west, because they hope for better opportunities, they begin to see the restrictions with covenants and stuff like that. And even when those covenants are removed, we see neighbors not welcoming them. And that's what this show kind of portrays. Now, there's an element of supernaturalism in the show, but try to avoid that in regards to the historical narrative, because from everything that I've read about this show, it's actually based on a few different stories. One of them being in Pacoima, where I grew up, which is a suburb out in the valley, in San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And in this community, it's so funny because I remember growing up in the 70s and 80s where you had white neighbors, you had a few African American families, and you had a growing Mexican and Mexican American population in these neighborhoods. And like I said at the beginning of the lecture, imagine yourself living in 1950s America. You bought yourself a house, right? It was restricted to whites only. And then by the 1960s, that goes away. And you see your neighborhood change. And where I grew up in Pacoima, I saw this shift happening because we had white neighbors. And, at that time, I didn't think much of it because I was a little kid. But most of those white neighbors tend to be older. Most of them retired. I remember they had a big RV, so they used to travel a lot. And they were really nice people. We really liked them. And but for the most part, they kept to themselves. And I remember going to their houses because they have the best Halloween candy. But you see this shift happening where as they're getting older, they're retiring. They had just paid off their probably their homes by 1980 something. And the neighborhood was going through that transitional aspect, and many of them were either selling or they were, some of them passed away and their kids came in and sold their houses. And it's so reflective of what we talk about here, right? And at that time, again, I cannot contextualize it because I was too young, but it was going through this shift where you did see this kind of white flight in the late 70s into the 1980s, where they're moving into these new suburban communities that were sprouting out towards the deserts of Palmdale or Rancho Cucamonga, and they were kind of rebuilding their white community out in these outskirts of Los Angeles. So it's quite fascinating of how these things happen. And lastly, I want to give you a few sources. So, for whatever reason, when I was in graduate school, I really enjoyed reading about the rise of conservatism because I just kind of found it fascinating of how all this kind of took place. And maybe it had to do with, again, growing up and seeing these things and now being able to contextualize it. There's a few kind of key studies here. Suburban Warriors, The Origins of the New American Right. This is a classic study you have to read if you're interested in this kind of subject matter. Another one is The End of the Republican Era, another kind of major classical study. And lastly, the other kind of classic study that you should read is From George Wallace to Newt Gingrich, The Race in the Conservative Counter Revolution. So again, these are all sources I use in this lecture, but in case you're interested, these sources are accessible to you either through our library or they might be at a different Maricopa campus library, and you can check them out. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If nothing else, hopefully you learned something about Compton that you probably never knew about, and make sure to complete the quiz.